The town of Blackwater Hollow sat in a bowl of hills where the fog never fully left, not even in August. It draped over the reservoir like a held breath, and the old-timers said it had been that way since 1981, since the night Eleanor Voss disappeared on the second evening of her marriage and never came home again. Detective Marisol Reyes had heard the story her whole life the way children in small towns hear such things. Softened at the edges, half myth, told at sleepovers to make girls shriek and pull their blankets tighter. A bride, 23 years old, married on a Saturday in a white dress with lace sleeves. Gone by Monday morning. No car missing. No struggle. No body. Just an open window in the honeymoon cabin at Loon Point, curtains lifting in the wind like something breathing. 32 years later, Marisol was 39, a detective with the county sheriff's department, and she had never once expected to touch that case. It belonged to the retired men who still drank coffee at the counter of Holly's diner and argued about whether Eleanor had run off with a lover or drowned trying to swim the reservoir in the dark. It belonged to the past. Then the drought came. By the third week of September, the reservoir had dropped 11 feet. The marina closed. Boat ramps stood on dry, cracked mud 50 yards from the waterline. And on a Tuesday morning, a fisherman named Kurt Adamson, wading out to reach a stranded trotline, put his boot through the roof of a car. The car was a 1979 Ford Fairmont, pale blue beneath 4 decades of silt, its windows blown out by pressure and time. It took the county's recovery crew most of a day to winch it free of the mud, and by the time the tow truck dragged it up onto the boat ramp, half the town had gathered along the guardrail to watch, the way people watch a storm they know is going to be bad. Marisol arrived as the crew was hosing the worst of the muck away. She didn't need to check the plate. She already knew, the way you know a name before you hear it spoken, because her grandmother used to say it like a superstition. Eleanor's car. Eleanor's car is still down there somewhere. It was. There was no body inside. That at least matched the old story. Eleanor had vanished from the cabin, not from the car. But the trunk held something that made the county coroner go very quiet. A woman's suitcase, zippered shut, the leather gone soft and black with rot, and inside it, wrapped in a dry cleaner's bag that had somehow kept its shape, a wedding dress. Not worn, folded, packed, the way a woman packs a dress she intends to wear again, or a dress someone else packs when they wanted to disappear with her. She never got in that car, said Walt Kessler, the retired sheriff who'd worked the original case in 1981, and whom Marisol had called out of respect more than necessity. He was 81 now, spine bent like a fishhook, but his eyes when they found the trunk went sharp as they must have been in 1981. Eleanor Voss walked out of that cabin in her nightgown. Half of Loon Point saw the light on. Nobody saw her get behind a wheel. Then who drove it into the lake? Walt didn't answer. He was looking at the dress. Eleanor's husband had been Daniel Voss, 26 years old in 1981, heir to the Voss Lumber Company, which at the time employed nearly a third of the working men in Blackwater Hollow. He had married Eleanor Marsh, a schoolteacher's daughter from 2 counties over, in a wedding that half the town still described as the finest Blackwater Hollow had ever seen. Daniel had died in 2009 of a heart attack at his desk in the lumber mill office, having remarried twice and buried both of those wives too, one to cancer, one more quietly, to what the death certificate called accidental overdose. He had one surviving child, a son named Peter Voss from his second marriage, who still lived in the old Voss house on the ridge above town and ran what remained of the family company, now reduced to a single struggling sawmill. Marisol drove up to see him the morning after the car was pulled from the water. Peter Voss was 51, silver-haired, dressed like a man who had learned early that appearances mattered more than comfort. He offered her coffee in a study lined with black and white photographs of Voss men standing beside felled trees, going back 4 generations. "I was 2 years old when Eleanor disappeared," Peter said. "I don't remember her, obviously. My mother, his second wife, never wanted her name spoken in this house. It was like Eleanor was a ghost the whole family had agreed not to see. Did your father ever talk about that night? Once, Peter's jaw tightened. I was maybe 17. Drunk, the both of us, which never happened. My father didn't drink, not after what people said about him in 1981. But that one night he told me he woke up and she was gone, and the window was open, and he sat on the edge of the bed for an hour before he even called anyone, because part of him thought she'd walk back in and laugh and say it was some kind of joke. Did you believe him? Peter set his coffee down. I don't know any more what I believe. I know the sheriff back then cleared him fast, too fast, some people said, because the Voss family owned half the town's paychecks. I know there was a rumor Eleanor had a man before the wedding, someone she didn't quite let go of. And I know that whatever's true, it's been sitting at the bottom of that reservoir for 32 years, and now it's not. His name, according to the yellowed case file Walt Kessler still kept in a filing box in his garage, was Nathaniel Cray. In 1980, when he'd been 24, a carpenter who did finish work for the Voss Company, and half the town's gossip in the weeks after Eleanor's disappearance had circled around him like water around a drain. Nathaniel Cray had left Blackwater Hollow 8 months after the wedding and never come back. The 1981 investigators had questioned him twice, found nothing, and let him go. A young man's grief, they'd decided nothing more. He was 66 now, living 3 hours north in a small house outside a town called Danvers, where he still did carpentry, mostly cabinets, mostly for people who found him through word of mouth. When Marisol called ahead, he didn't sound surprised. I wondered when the lake would finally do it, he said. I wondered every year, actually, when the water got low. She drove up that afternoon. Nathaniel Cray was a tall man gone stooped, with sawdust worked so deeply into the creases of his hands it looked like part of his skin. He made her tea she didn't want and sat across from her at a kitchen table scarred with 40 years of cut lines. I loved her, he said, before she'd asked a single question. Before Daniel Voss ever put a ring on her finger, I loved Eleanor Marsh and she loved me, and neither one of us had a nickel between us. And her mother made sure she understood what that meant. Daniel Voss had a name. I had a toolbox. Did you see her after the wedding? Twice. He said it like a confession he'd been carrying so long it no longer had any weight to lose. Once at the grocery by accident. Once on purpose, 3 weeks before she disappeared. She came to find me. She was frightened of something, detective, and it wasn't me. Frightened of what? Nathaniel turned his teacup a quarter turn, the way a man does when he's deciding how much of a story to tell. She said Daniel had a temper nobody saw but her. She said there'd been a night, not long after the honeymoon started, where he'd put his hand around her throat over something small, a dish left in the sink, I think it was, God help us all, and let go before it went further, and told her if she ever told anyone he'd say she was hysterical, and everyone would believe him, because everyone in this town owed the Voss family a paycheck. Marisol felt the room tilt slightly, the way it does when an old story cracks open along a seam nobody had noticed. You never told the sheriff this in 1981. I told Walt Kessler exactly that in his own office, 3 days after she vanished. Nathaniel's voice didn't rise, but something underneath it did. And Walt Kessler told me that unless I had a mark on my body or a signed confession, accusing the richest family in the county of putting hands on their new bride was a good way to lose my carpentry contracts for the rest of my natural life. So I said nothing more, and I have hated myself for it every year since. Marisol didn't confront Walt directly, not yet. Instead, she went back to the case file, the real one, the thin cardboard folder that had sat in the department archive for 32 years, and read it end to end for the first time since she'd been a teenager, sneaking peeks at it out of morbid curiosity. It was thinner than it should have been. 14 pages for a missing bride whose disappearance had made the front page of 3 regional papers. No mention of Nathaniel Cray's second interview. No mention of any prior violence in the marriage. A single line in Walt Kessler's own handwriting that read, "Husband cooperative. No signs of foul play. Case likely voluntary departure." Voluntary departure. As if Eleanor Marsh had simply grown tired of her own wedding and walked into the fog. Marisol drove out to Walt's house that evening, the file on the passenger seat like something radioactive. Walt met her on the porch, and something in her face must have told him what she'd found, because he didn't invite her in. He sat down heavily in a rocking chair that had clearly been his for decades and looked out at the darkening hills. "I was 30 years old," he said, before she could speak. "First real case of my career where the family that owned the mill was involved. And old man Harlan Voss, Daniel's father, sat me down in his office 2 days after the wedding and told me, very politely, that the Voss family had built this town's roads and this town's school and paid for the hospital wing where my own daughter was born, and that he expected the investigation to be handled with, and I remember this word exactly, discretion. You buried it." I told myself I was protecting a grieving husband from a town's ugly gossip. Walt's hands, spotted with age, gripped the arms of the rocking chair. But I knew, detective, somewhere under all my justifications, I knew there was a young carpenter telling me the truth, and I chose a paycheck and a school board seat over chasing it. I have 32 years of nights to answer for that. "Did you ever suspect Daniel killed her?" Walt was quiet for a long moment. "I suspected everything," he finally said. "I just never let myself write any of it down." The forensics team that processed the Fairmont found something Marisol hadn't expected. A second, smaller item wedged behind the driver's seat, protected from the worst of the water by the angle at which the car had sunk. A woman's jewelry box, its lock long rusted shut, which the lab pried open under controlled conditions 3 days later. Inside were things that had clearly not belonged in a trunk headed for the bottom of a lake by accident. A wedding ring, not Eleanor's. The engraving inside read a different set of initials, NC and EM. A photograph, water-damaged but salvageable, of a young Eleanor Marsh laughing on the tailgate of a truck beside a young Nathaniel Cray. And a folded letter. The ink long since bled into illegibility on most of the page, except for a single line near the bottom, preserved by some accident of the paper's fold, that the lab technician read aloud to Marisol over the phone with something like reverence in her voice. "If anything happens to me, look at the water first." Marisol sat with that sentence for a long time. It wasn't a suicide note. It wasn't a runaway's farewell. It read like something a frightened woman leaves behind on purpose, a message aimed not at whoever might find her, but at whoever might come looking. The honeymoon cabin at Loon Point still stood, though it had passed through 4 owners since 1981 and now operated as a seasonal rental, its interior gutted and remodeled twice over. Marisol walked its rooms anyway, because sometimes a place holds something a file cannot. The current owner, an elderly woman named Ruth Alcott, who had bought the property in 1994, remembered the local legend well enough to have an opinion about it. "That window," she said, pointing to the bedroom's east-facing frame long since replaced, "people used to say it was found wide open, curtain blowing like she just floated out of it. But my husband, God rest him, he did some contracting work on this cabin back in the late 80s for the owner before us, and he always said that window didn't open easy. Warped frame. Took 2 hands and a shove." Meaning a woman running for her life in a panic might have forced it, or meaning somebody wanted it to look like she had. Marisol stood in the small bedroom a long while, looking out at the reservoir through trees that hadn't existed in 1981, at the water that had kept a car and a jewelry box and a wedding dress folded like a secret for 32 years, and thought, look at the water first. She had. The water had given her a car with no body in it, and a letter suggesting the answer wasn't drowning at all. It was a detail so small Marisol almost dismissed it. The Reservoir Authority kept old maintenance logs from the decade the dam had been renovated, including 1981, when a temporary access road had been cut along the reservoir's northern edge for construction equipment, a road that, according to the map, ran less than a quarter-mile from the back of the Voss family's private hunting lodge, itself less than 2 miles from Loon Point by trail. Marisol drove out to the lodge, which Peter Voss still owned and rarely used. He met her there without protest, unlocking a building that smelled of dust and old cedar. In a storage room off the lodge's kitchen, behind decades of accumulated furniture and boxed hunting gear, Marisol found a floor hatch, a root cellar, unremarkable except that when she pulled it open and shone her flashlight down, the space below was larger than a root cellar had any reason to be, with a second door at the far end, and behind that door, a narrow room with a single cot frame, rusted now to lace, and a floor drain that never should have been necessary in a food cellar. Peter Voss stood at the top of the hatch, his face gone the color of old paper. "I didn't know this was here," he said. "I swear to you, detective, I did not know." Marisol believed him. She also believed, standing in that cellar with 32 years of dust settling around her boots, that she had just found the place Eleanor Voss had actually spent whatever time remained to her after that open window at Loon Point, and that the car in the lake had never been about hiding a body at all. It had been about hiding a story, the story of a bride who ran, who was caught, and who was never seen leaving that lodge alive. The state forensic anthropology team spent 6 days at the lodge before they found what the cellar's drain had been built to manage. Eleanor Voss had been buried beneath the cellar floor itself, under 2 feet of poured concrete that predated any renovation Peter Voss had records for. Concrete that, according to the material analysis, matched a batch delivered to the Voss Lumber Company's own equipment yard in the autumn of 1981. Dental records closed the identification within the week. Eleanor Marsh Voss, 23 years old at the time of her death, had never left Blackwater Hollow at all. She had been 3 miles from the wedding chapel the entire time, through 32 winters of ice on the reservoir and 32 summers of drought that never quite dropped the water far enough, until this one did. The medical examiner's report noted a fracture to the hyoid bone consistent with manual strangulation. It was, in the end, exactly what Nathaniel Cray had described to Marisol across his kitchen table. A temper nobody was permitted to see, finally allowed to finish what it had begun weeks earlier over a dish left in a sink. Daniel Voss had died in 2009 believing, apparently, that he had gotten away with it. Perhaps he had for a while, but water remembers what it's given, even when it takes 32 years to give it back. There was one person Marisol had not yet spoken to, and she had been putting it off the way you put off the hardest phone call on a long list. Ruth Ann Marsh Prout, Eleanor's younger sister, 70 years old now and living alone in the same 2-county-over town where the Marsh girls had grown up. Ruth Ann had spent 32 years writing letters to sheriffs, to newspapers, to a private investigator she'd hired for 2 years in the early 90s, until her husband's disability checks couldn't stretch to cover it anymore. Marisol had found the letters in the department archive, a whole second folder nobody had bothered to attach to the official case file, because a grieving sister's persistence had never been treated as evidence of anything except grief. Ruth then answered her door already knowing somehow before Marisol said a word. "You found her," she said. It wasn't a question. They sat in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and old photographs, and Ruth then pulled out a shoebox she had clearly pulled out for 100 other visitors over the decades, reporters, private investigators, well-meaning neighbors who never had anything new to offer. This time, for the first time, she had something new to receive instead of give. "I always told people it wasn't like her to run," Ruth then said, turning a photograph over in her hands, the same photograph from the jewelry box, Eleanor laughing on a tailgate beside Nathaniel Cray, except this copy still had its color intact, protected from water and time by a shoebox and a sister's stubbornness. Everybody in this town decided that a bride who disappeared must have wanted to disappear. Nobody ever once considered that maybe she was trying to get somewhere, and someone stopped her before she made it. She wrote a letter, Marisol said gently. We found part of it in the car. She said, if anything happens to me, look at the water first. Ruthan's hands went still over the photograph. She sent me a letter too, she said quietly. 3 days before the wedding. I never told the sheriff in 1981 because by the time I worked up the courage to bring it in, Walt Kessler had already closed the file as a voluntary departure, and I was a 22-year-old nobody standing in a sheriff's office being told, very kindly, that I should let my sister live her own life. She rose, disappeared into a back bedroom, and returned with a small tin box, the kind meant for recipe cards, its lid dented at one corner from 4 decades of handling. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, the ink still legible because it had never touched water at all, because Eleanor had mailed this one, and the reservoir had never had the chance to swallow it. Ruthie, it read, in handwriting Marisol now recognized from the case file's few surviving samples. I am going to marry him on Saturday because Mother says there's no undoing an invitation list. And because I am afraid of what happens to a Marsh girl who backs out of a wedding to the Voss family in this town. But I want you to know, in case my courage fails me later and I can't say it out loud, Daniel frightens me. Not the way boys frighten girls before a wedding, the other way. If something happens to me, don't let them call at me running off. I have never run from anything in my life, and I am not going to start with my own marriage. Love always, your Eleanor. Marisol read it twice, and felt something settle into place that had been rattling loose since the day the Fairmont came up out of the mud, not the mechanics of the crime, which she now understood completely, but the shape of the silence around it. A frightened bride had written down the truth in advance twice to 2 different people, and both letters had survived the very disappearance meant to erase her. And still, it had taken 32 years and a drought for anyone to read them side by side. Why didn't you push harder? Marisol asked, not as an accusation, but because she needed to understand how a truth could sit in a tin box for 3 decades while a town told itself a comfortable story instead. I did push, Ruthan said, and for the first time her composure cracked just slightly at the corners. I pushed for years. I hired a man with a mustache and a rusted Buick who took my husband's disability money and found nothing, because he was looking at motels and bus stations instead of a hunting lodge 2 miles from where she vanished. I wrote to 3 governors. I wrote to a television program that never wrote back. Eventually, you learn that a town can outlast a grieving sister, detective. A town has all the time in the world. I only had 1 lifetime, and Eleanor was using up a good portion of it, unfairly, by simply refusing to be found. Marisol left Ruthan's house with the letter photographed and logged into evidence, and with something else she hadn't expected to carry away, a clearer understanding of exactly how many people a single crime can go on quietly punishing, year after year, long after the person responsible for it believes he has gotten away clean. Marisol drove out to see Nathaniel Cray one final time, to tell him in person before the story broke in the papers. He listened to all of it, the cellar, the concrete, the fracture, sitting very still at his kitchen table, his sawdust-creased hands folded in front of him like a man at a funeral he had been waiting 3 decades to attend. When she finished, he didn't cry, though his eyes were wet. I used to think, he said slowly, that if I just said something louder in 1981, made more noise, refused to be quiet the way Walt Kessler told me to be, she might still be alive somewhere, living some other life. I could have made peace with never seeing her again if I believed she'd chosen it. You told the truth when it counted, Marisol said. The system failed to listen. That's not the same as failing her. He nodded, but she could see he didn't fully believe her, and she understood that some grief simply doesn't allow itself to be talked down. Walt Kessler gave a formal statement 2 weeks later, admitting under oath what he'd told Marisol on his porch, that he had let the Voss family's influence shape the original investigation, that Nathaniel Cray's warning had been discarded rather than followed. He was 81, too old and too diminished by the years for any prosecutor to seriously pursue charges of obstruction, but the county board quietly removed his name from the plaque outside the sheriff's department that had honored his 30 years of service. And Marisol thought that, too, was its own kind of justice, small and late as it was. Peter Voss closed the lodge permanently and donated the land, cellar and all, to the county, which eventually turned it into a small memorial garden, a single stone bench beneath the cedars, engraved simply, Eleanor Marsh Voss, 1958–1981, remembered at last. A year later, when the drought finally broke and the reservoir began to climb back toward its ordinary shoreline, Marisol drove out to Loon Point one more time, alone, on an evening thick with the first real fog of autumn. She stood at the water's edge and thought about all the things a lake can hold on to without ever once telling anyone what it knows: a car, a dress, a letter folded shut around a single warning sentence, a truth 32 years buried under concrete, and a town's willingness not to ask hard questions of the family that signed its paychecks. Look at the water first. Eleanor Voss had known, even at 23, even frightened and cornered and almost certainly aware of what was coming for her, that someone would eventually look. She had left the only kind of message available to a woman with no one else who would believe her. Not a confession to save herself, because by then there may have been no saving herself at all, but a single line meant to outlast her, waiting patiently at the bottom of a reservoir for 32 years, until a drought and a fisherman's trot line finally did what a town full of people should have done decades before. Marisol watched the fog curl low over the water the way it had every autumn of her life, and for the first time it didn't feel like a mystery holding its breath. It felt like something, finally, exhaling. In memory of every name, a town chose not to say too loudly.